We've all been there. You want to do a spot of decorating, but you've got a radiator in the way. You can't get a mini roller or a brush behind it, and you need to get some paint on the wall. So the removal and refitting of a radiator is one of them little jobs that all homeowners should really know, because it'll always come in useful. And it's one of them jobs that appears quite difficult, but actually using the right techniques and tools, you can remove a radiator like this and refit it in about 5 minutes. So let me show you how. Now, before you touch the radiator, if your heating system is a pressurized system, you need to be familiar with the boiler pressure. Take a mental note of the pressure in your heating system currently. This one's digital, but a lot of boilers do still have a traditional gauge, and if you need to, take a photo, because that's going to be relevant later on in the process. Now, if you've got a vented heating system, and you'll know that you've got one of those because you'll have tanks in the loft, if you've got one of those, you don't need to worry about that boiler pressure stage. Now, to work on this radiator, we need to isolate it from the rest of the heating system, and to do that, we'll turn off the valves at each end. Now, you may have a couple of different types of valves. This is a thermostatic radiator valve, or TRV for short, and under this little white cap there is a lock shield valve. Those are the two most common types of valves you're likely to find on your radiators. So how do we turn them off and isolate this radiator? Currently this TRV is set to number 6, but to close that right off, we'll turn it clockwise. Remember this, righty tighty, lefty loosey. So our TRV here is now in the fully closed position. The lock shield valve needs to be fully closed off as well as the TRV to isolate the radiator from the rest of the heating system. To close the lock shield, we're going to use an adjustable spanner. Place the adjustable spanner on the pin on the top of the valve. But this time we need to memorize the number of turns, because that will be important when we put the radiator back on. We're going to need to open this valve up the same number of turns to keep the system balanced. So let's begin turning this now. So that's 1 turn, that is 2 turns, and there we go, that valve is now closed. So that is 2 full turns, remember that for later. So now both of these valves are closed, we've got this radiator isolated from the rest of the heating system. That means no water pressure from the rest of the heating system can enter this radiator. So the next step is to release the pressure from this radiator. So we'll grab one of these. This is a radiator bleed key. I'll put a link in the description where you can grab one of these. So we'll use this to remove the pressure on the radiator. To do that, find the radiator bleed valve. On slightly more modern radiators, they'll often look like this. It's very common. Sometimes on slightly older radiators, you don't have this white plastic bit, but your radiator key will still work. So place that radiator key on there. Make sure that the hole in the bleed valve is facing away from the wall. Otherwise, you're likely to get dirty water all over the wall. Now, I know that doesn't matter if you're decorating, but when you put it back on, it will, and you won't be very popular. Now, we'll turn this bleed key anti-clockwise, and you're going to see some water come out of here. If there's air in the system, you might hear a little bit of hissing. There we go. So you can see there's water. I'll open it a bit more so you can see there's water flowing from that valve. Just catch all that water with a cloth. Don't worry, it can take a minute or two for all the pressure to come out of the radiator. If it doesn't stop flowing, that means that the valves are not holding and there's water still coming from the rest of the heating system into the radiator. If that happens, you would not be able to progress. You'd have an issue with one of the valves that you'd need to look at first. But you can see here that that flow of water has now stopped, so we can close that up now. So if we take a look here, this is the nut connecting the valve to the radiator. So I'm going to undo that nut now. You could undo either side. You can do the lock shield side or the side where the TRV is. It doesn't really matter. The result will be the same. When we undo this nut, any water that's held in this radiator is going to drain down until the radiator is near enough empty. Now lay a couple of towels down before you do this next step, and don't use the best towels in the house because you tend to upset senior management if you do that. Now we need something to collect the water. This is a plum tub. These are great because they allow you to get really close to the wall to catch all that water. Of course, the bigger the radiator, the more water is going to be held in here. This is quite a small one and it's a single panel radiator. If you've got a double panel radiator, there will be even more water held in there. So what you'll need as well as this is a bucket, because this isn't going to hold quite enough water. The plumb tubs are great because they allow you to get really close to the wall and they clip around the pipe, so any water that runs down the pipe just runs into the tub. If you don't have a plumb tub, you can just use a roller tray like this, but you probably will lose a little bit on the floor because it doesn't get quite as tight to the pipe as what the plumb tub does. So place that under the valve, and now you're going to need your adjustable spanner again. Of course, you can adjust that to the size of the nut to undo the nut, and you're going to need a pair of plumbing grips so you can hold the valve with those, and that way you don't put unnecessary pressure on the valve. Grab your adjustable spanner and just slacken off the nut, and with your fingers just undo that nut all the way. You can let go of the valve now. You can see water's starting to come out of there. If you pull the valve away, this will depend how tight the pipework is, but if you can pull that valve away very slightly, the water will exit quicker. Now, of course, the time that it takes for that to drain will vary dependent on the size of the radiator. Now, there is a way to speed the process of the water draining up. By draining the water out of there, we're actually creating a vacuum or pulling a vacuum. So what we can do is just open that bleed valve up again. By opening that up and allowing air in, that water level can drop quicker. It should take 5 minutes or so anyway, so sit back and wait it out. So we're down to a drip now. You can see there's nothing else coming out of the radiator. So the fact that that's stopped flowing now means the water level's dropped right down to the bottom of the radiator. There's probably a little bit left in here, but I'll show you how to get that out in a minute. What we'll do now, just use the key to close up that bleed valve again. Close that up for now, and in exactly the same way as we did before, we'll just slacken off the other end of the radiator. What we'll do now is just tilt the radiator up on the brackets. There'll be a couple of brackets under here, and the water that's left in the bottom there will just come out into our tub. Tilt the radiator, and if you look there, you can see there's a little bit of water running into the tub. We just lowered that back down onto the brackets for now. So the radiator is ready to come off now. So we can now lift the radiator and move it away from the wall just like that, nice and easy. Tip the radiator upside down, that way no water can come out and we can just move that out of the way. And what you can do now is get your decorating done. Obviously you'll have paint on your roller. But before we move on to refitting the radiator, there's one more little tip that I've got for you. Just because a TRV like this is turned all the way off doesn't mean that they can't open if it gets very cold in the room. Now, TRVs come with a decorator's cap, or you can buy decorator's caps. Pop a decorator cap on, and that way the TRV cannot possibly open up. Or I just keep one of these in my plumbing bag. You can actually see it's got paint on it already where I've done this exact job. These little 1/2-inch caps here. So if I'm doing this job and leaving these off for some time, I tend to just pop one of these on, and that way no water can come out of this valve even if the TRV opens back up. So I'll show you how to replace the radiator, how to bleed it to get air out of it, and how to repressurize the system if you're on a pressurized system. Before we do that, if the video is helping you out, please hit the like button because it allows it to help more people on YouTube, and hit subscribe because you don't want to miss out on all the videos I've got to come. And if you haven't already, check out the DIY Club. The links to that will be in the description below. Right, let's get this radiator reinstalled. So bring the radiator back into position and just flip it over, and then we'll lift it onto the brackets. If it's a very heavy radiator, you might want someone to help you one end just to get this onto the brackets nice and easily. So we'll lift the radiator back onto the brackets. Line it up with the valves. You can see that is now on. You can see it's nice and level. This one's really tight to the wall, but often you'll be able to look down behind the radiator and you'll see that it's located onto the lugs on the bracket. Realign the valves and pipework. And what I want to do is just apply a little bit of joint and compound just onto that olive. Just a very small amount. And that just lubricates the olive and helps it to seal. Now, like we did before, use the pliers to hold the valve so we don't put any stress on it, and use your adjustable spanner to do the nut back up. Just nip that up nice and tight. Do that for both ends. Once both valves are tightened back up, you can open up the lock shield valve. Now you're going to hear that water start to travel into the radiator when you do this. If you listen, hopefully my microphone will pick this up. That is water travelling back into the radiator. Now remember, we want to open this lock shield valve up, by 2 turns, because that is where it was before. If you don't open the valve up to where it was before, the balancing won't be correct. If you do need to balance your heating system, I do have a video that will show you how to do that. Now we can move up to the thermostatic radiator valve and open that one up as well. So now we've opened the 2 valves back up, water can travel back into the radiator. But by doing this job, we've introduced air into the radiator. To get rid of that air, we need to bleed the radiator. So grab your radiator bleed key, open up that bleed valve like we did before, and if you hear that, that hissing sound is the air coming out of that radiator. Once you get water coming from the valve, you can close the valve off. There you go, you can see water flowing from the valve. Just close the valve back off nice and tight. Now we'll give the connections a little check for leaks. We're all good there, and we'll head to the boiler and check the pressure. So you can see here my boiler's saying that the system pressure is too low. That's because when we filled that radiator back up, the pressure has dropped in the system. Again, if you're not on a pressurized system, that doesn't matter. If you are, it's time to top up the pressure using the filling loop. To increase the pressure, simply pull down on the filling loop and you'll hear a hissing sound as water runs into the system. And finally, you may want to consider adding a little bit of inhibitor to the system, because of course by doing this job you might have lost some inhibitor from the system. I hope you guys have enjoyed the video and found it helpful. If you have, click on one of these videos because there's so much more to learn, and I'll see you guys in the next one.